Welcome to the 2023 Bleaseling Quilt Along. I'm Laura Struck from Made Peachy, and over this series of videos we're going to work towards creating a sampler quilt. In this video we're going to walk through the process of completing the sampler quilt using the Quilt-As-You-Go method. Once you have one or more of the sampler blocks completed, you can begin the Quilt-As-You-Go method. The Quilt-As-You-Go method means rather than joining all of our blocks together, adding in our wadding and then backing fabric and quilting all as one large piece, we're going to quilt in individual sections and then join them together. So in this video I'm going to show you how we work our Quilt-As-You-Go method to join the two blocks together, which is the same process to create the entire Quilt-As-You-Go quilt. So we have our completed block, and this measures 8 inches square. I've cut some wadding and I've actually cut this slightly smaller, so it's actually 1/4 of an inch smaller than the finished block, and this is going to give us just a small amount of seam allowance where our wadding isn't going to be caught inside of the seam. And I also have some backing fabric, and I've cut this slightly larger, so this is approximately 2 inches larger, so I've done it 11 inches square. So to begin the process, what I'm going to do is position my block with the wrong side uppermost. So here I've got the grid side facing upwards, and my batting is going to be sandwiched in next. The batting I'm using here is the 268 bamboo mix batting. So I've popped that down on top, and what we need to do is to base these layers into position. Because this is quite a small project, I'm happy to use a spray based. So I'm going to roll back the batting, apply the spray based onto one portion and press into position, and then peeling back the second half. Of course you can pin or you can tack stitch baste your quilt layers. If you're using a spray base, just make sure that you've got a ventilated room. So now that I have my wadding secured temporarily onto my quilt block, I can add the backing. Again, I'm going to be working in the same principle. So I'm going to be positioning the fabric on top, the right side outermost if you have a printed cotton. And here again, I'm just going to roll back, and I spray. If I'm using a spray, I'm going to put it directly onto the wadding and press into place. And again, just adding a small touch of spray and securing. Here the layers are all basted together, the quilt top, the wadding and the backing. We can begin to prepare for quilting. The main thing about quilting for Quilt-As-You-Go is we're going to need to leave a border that is unquilted. So I'm not going to be taking my quilting right to the edge. One thing you can do is mark on your border, or actually stitch a border in before you work, and then that will remind you that you're not taking your stitches beyond that outer section. Reason being, we're going to need to seam our blocks together, so we want to have this portion free around each of the sides where we need to join in our next block. Over at the sewing machine, I've made a few adjustments to my setup. So I have swapped in my regular foot for a walking foot, and I have added my sewing machine extension table. Whilst I'm only working with small blocks here and not a large quilt, it actually just holds everything nice and securely for me, and I can see where I'm working. When working the quilting details, you might want to change up your thread. So I've opted for a different colour thread, and I'm taking a much heavier weight thread here. So you might want to opt for something really heavy like this, a 30 or a 40 weight thread perhaps, depending on the finished look of your quilt. Remember, when you're sizing up your thread and you're working with something heavy like this, you're going to need to consider what needle you've got. So I've actually sized to a 90 needle here for this one, as I'm working with such a heavyweight thread. For my stitch length here, I'm opting for a number 3 stitch length. You may like to experiment with a different stitch length in combination with your needle and your fabrics to see what works best for your quilt. So to begin stitching, I'm going to just bring my threads to the side. So I've brought my needle down in place, and I've kept my thread ends out to the side. There's a couple of other accessories alongside your extension table you might like to consider. Quilting gloves are really handy to help give you some grip on your project, whether you opt for 1 or 2 hands. And also you might like to grab a pair of small snips. Reason being, many machines have an automatic thread cutter, and I want you to avoid using your thread cutter when you're doing the quilting work. We want to have a small tail of thread left after each line of stitching rather than cutting the thread ends. We want to have a piece of thread that we can actually sink back and secure into the project. So working with our desired stitch length or decorative stitch that we've chosen, we're going to just begin working carefully along our quilting lines. Just using my hands to carefully hold the quilt steady while I work the stitches. Once the stitching is complete, rather than using the automatic thread cutter, I'm going to raise the needle and I'm going to carefully draw the work backwards. I don't want to be pulling too hard, which will cause stress on my needle and on my completed work. I want to make sure I've left quite a long tail of thread here, and I'm going to use my snips to trim that down, and my block is quilted. When the block's been quilted, I'm going to just neaten everything up before I join in my next block. So what I'm going to do is I've threaded the cut ends of the quilting thread, and I'm going to sink those, and I'm just going to do that by making a small stitch, working into the quilt top and the batting, and then bringing it straight down. So that stitch is locking the threads, and we're not coming out onto the wrong side of the quilt, so on the reverse of the quilt. The threads are going to be held inside, and I'm going to draw it away and simply snip away the threads. So all of our tail ends of threads are going to be sunk inside the quilt. I'm going to repeat that for all of the thread ends that are on my quilt block. When you have 2 or more quilted blocks, you can begin the process of joining them together. So the joining process is worked in 2 stages, and the reason for this is so that all of our seams, when we make the joins, they're going to be enclosed inside of the quilt. So the first task is going to be joining the front portion of the quilt, so this quilt top section here. I'm going to begin the process by first of all neatening up this backing fabric so we're ready to join the tops. To do so, I am going to trim off all of the backing fabric so that it's level with the quilt top, so this nice square line of the block. So I'm taking this over to my cutting mat, and I'm going to place my ruler down, and with a rotary cutter just taking a nice neat cut just to create a complete square with the backing and the quilt top. To prepare to stitch these front portions, I'm going to just prepare the backing fabrics, and to do so I'm going to make sure that these are pressed well out of the way of our sewing line. So I'm first just going to quickly press it and then pop in a couple of pins so that I know that these won't get caught up in my sewing line. I'm going to also repeat the process for the block that's going to be joined in so that all of the backing fabrics on the seam that we're going to work are held fully out of the way. With the backing fabrics pinned out of the way, I'm going to return each of the blocks to the right side. I'm going to place them right sides together, and I'm going to align the raw edges of the block. And because they're nice and square, I'm going to be able to get those lined up really easily and really quickly. So just using pins or clips here, just to hold everything into position. And we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we're going to join these 2 blocks together, working just through these quilt tops, taking a 1/4 inch seam all the way along this length. Over at the sewing machine, ready to join these 2 sections together, I've made a couple of updates to my sewing machine setup. I've returned to a lighter weight cotton, so a 50 weight cotton here for piecing these elements, just to keep the bulk reduced on this seam. As a result, I've sized my needle down again to a size 80. I'm opting for a 2mm stitch length for joining this section here. I'm going to be taking a 1/4 inch seam, so my needle is positioned a 1/4 inch from this raw edge here. I've kept the extension table on purely because it gives me somewhere to lay my work, keep everything flat whilst I'm stitching. And I'm also keeping the walking foot. The reason for this is, even though we're not stitching through the bulk of this quilt portion here, it does help to bring the quilt through, so bring these quilt blocks through the machine. If you prefer to work with your standard foot on this section, that's absolutely fine. Just ensure that you maintain your 1/4 inch seam. So with my needle down, I'm just going to begin carefully stitching all the way across, removing the pins and clips as I go. With the sections joined along the front, we can open it out and reveal the quilt piece. The final stage is to now join the backing fabric. And before I do so, I'm just going to give everything a nice light press and then prepare the backing fabric. To join the backing fabrics, what we need to do is to press the seam allowance here of our quilt tops to one side, and we're going to use one element of the backing fabric to cover that over, and this remaining portion will be used to create the back seam. So I'm going to pop everything onto the pressing mat. My first press is going to be to press all of the quilt top seam allowance over to one side. And once I've done that, I'm going to then pass the backing fabric over the top. And that's going to follow in the same direction. I'm now left with one remaining piece of backing fabric, and this is going to be brought over and seamed. Of course, we want to conceal this raw edge, and what I'm going to do is simply place a small fold over the raw edges, just turning them over and just press them in place. So I've got my folded edge of backing here, and I'm going to bring that over to seal up this section of seam. So just carefully popping in a couple of pins just to secure. With the backing fabrics folded and pinned in place, all of the raw edges have been concealed, and the last task is to simply join this back seam here. To do so, we can either take that over to the machine and work a line of straight stitching all the way across. The thing to remember with that is if you use the machine, that line of stitching will be visible on the front of the work. Alternatively, you can work with a needle and thread. I've got a small length of cotton. I've used the same cotton as I have for joining those front seams. And you can simply work with a whip stitch. So I will do so by catching the backing fabric, making a small stitch, and then bringing through this upper folded section. If I work very close to the fold, I can make sure my stitches appear very discreet, if not invisible. So just working all the way across, taking a small stitch at the back of the fabric, and then a stitch through the fold. Once the backing has been secured in place, then we can take a look at the joined quilt blocks. So these blocks are now joined, and we can continue adding in another block to complete the row and working in the same manner to complete the entire quilt. Once you've completed all of your rows and joined them all together, you can finish your quilt by adding some binding to your edges. Be sure to check out the other videos in the series to create all 9 blocks of your sampler quilt. Thank you so much for joining me for the Vlieslein 2023 Quilt Along. You can find out more about the Vlieslein products on the Vlieslein website at vlieslein.com, and you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Vlieslein UK. You can find me online at madepeachy.com. Please do share your projects online and tag us in your makes. We do love to see them.